The hum of the airplane filled the air as the first-class cabin settled into its smooth rhythm. Soft golden lights glowed above the beige leather seats. The passengers around were relaxed, scrolling on tablets or sipping drinks from crystal-clear glasses. In seat 2 sat a black businesswoman named Brielle Thomas. Her black suit was crisp, perfectly tailored, and her hair was neatly pulled back. Everything about her said confidence and calm authority. Brielle had just boarded after finishing an important business deal overseas. As the CEO of a growing tech firm, she was used to long flights and quiet cabins. She took a deep breath and looked out the window, taking in the clouds drifting past. The flight had only just begun. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. She picked it up, her voice low and firm. "Yes, the contract's finalized. I'll send the report once I land," she said. Her tone was focused, calm, and completely in control. Just then, a flight attendant walked down the aisle. She had a white serving cloth over her arm and a tray in hand. The smell of warm butter and spices floated from the gourmet dishes she served to the nearby passengers. The attendant reached Brielle's row. Without a word or a smile, she placed a plate in front of Brielle. Plain bread, dry and pale, and a small plastic cup of water. There was no butter, no fruit, no warmth in the gesture. Brielle looked at the plate, then up at the woman. The flight attendant turned without explanation and moved to the next seat. Across the aisle, 2 white businessmen sat comfortably. One of them was already eating a full meal: colorful vegetables, roasted chicken, a soft roll with butter, and a glass of sparkling water. He laughed at something his friend said, and then glanced over at Brielle. There was a smirk on his face. Not a word was said, but the message was loud. Brielle's eyes stayed steady. She didn't react. She didn't ask for anything. She just looked at the simple tray in front of her, then folded her hands in her lap. Her silence spoke louder than any words could have. She had been in rooms where people doubted her. She had stood in front of crowds who didn't expect her to lead. And yet, she had always walked forward with her head high. The plane carried on through the sky, but something had shifted. The air felt different, tense, heavy. Brielle said nothing. She simply returned to her phone, finished her call, and placed the device neatly back on the tray. She knew who she was. She didn't need a meal to prove it. As the flight continued, Brielle sat in quiet reflection. She had grown used to these moments, where the world seemed to move around her without truly noticing her presence. It wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, and it wouldn't be the last. People often judged others based on appearances or assumptions, and she had learned early on not to let it bother her. Still, she couldn't help but feel a sense of discomfort linger in the air. The flight attendant returned a few minutes later, moving down the aisle again, this time with a tray of empty coffee cups and a faint scent of freshly brewed coffee. She glanced at Brielle for a moment, almost as if she remembered something, but then quickly shifted her focus to another passenger. The businessmen across the aisle were still talking and laughing, oblivious to the quiet tension in the cabin. Brielle noticed the way the attendant had looked at her, a flicker of hesitation before she moved on. It was as if there was something she should have said, something she had forgotten. But Brielle wasn't interested in drawing attention to herself. She had other things on her mind, bigger things. Her company was on the verge of a breakthrough, and she had an important meeting scheduled the next day with a potential partner. Her mind was focused on strategies, numbers, and future plans. The situation on the plane, though uncomfortable, was something she could deal with later. Outside the window, the sky was changing. The soft orange of sunset stretched across the horizon, casting a gentle glow inside the cabin. Brielle turned her head and looked out, feeling the warmth of the light on her face. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to relax. The world below was small, and up here in the sky, she felt a sense of freedom. It wasn't about the petty things, like an unkind flight attendant or an unspoken judgment. It was about where she was going, where she had already been, and how much further she could push herself and her business. She heard a chuckle from one of the businessmen. He was looking directly at her now, his eyes scanning her from head to toe, as though he were trying to figure out what made her so different. The glance lingered for a moment, and Briel knew exactly what he was thinking. His smile widened, and he whispered something to his colleague. Both of them laughed lightly, but Briel didn't flinch. She simply turned back to her seat, straightened her back, and closed her eyes for a moment. She wasn't bothered by their whispers. People would always talk, but it wasn't her job to make them stop. It was her job to keep moving forward. As the flight progressed, Briel decided to focus on her goals. She had worked hard to get where she was, and no amount of ignorance or disrespect would stop her from achieving what she set out to do. Her company, her vision, her future, that's what mattered most. Everything else, she reminded herself, was just noise. The airplane cabin remained quiet, but there was an undeniable tension that hung in the air. Briel's gaze drifted out of the window once more, watching the sun dip lower, the light now fading into cool shades of purple and blue. It was hard to ignore the stares from the men across the aisle. Their conversation had shifted, and now they were whispering to each other in hushed tones, glancing at Briel between every word. She could feel their eyes, the silent judgment that followed her every move, but she didn't give them the satisfaction of reacting. Instead, she opened her tablet and began reviewing the notes for her upcoming meeting. Her fingers moved swiftly over the screen, flipping through presentations and proposals. Her mind was focused. The distractions around her would not sway her from what she needed to accomplish. It wasn't the first time she had been in a situation where people underestimated her. Briel had always worked harder than most to prove herself, and each challenge had made her stronger. She had learned that success wasn't about how others saw her. It was about the goals she set for herself and how she achieved them. In moments like these, when others tried to make her feel small, she had to remind herself that she was in control. The plane's lights flickered as the seatbelt sign came on, signaling that they were preparing to land. The sound of the overhead compartments closing and the soft hum of the engine's shifting gears filled the cabin. Passengers began to gather their belongings, pulling out phones and laptops, preparing to exit the plane. But Briel remained calm, finishing her notes and making sure everything was in order. She wasn't rushing. There was no need to rush. She heard a soft cough from across the aisle, followed by a low voice. "You've got a lot of work to do," one of the businessmen asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Briel ignored him at first, continuing to tap on her tablet. She had learned not to respond to these kinds of comments, but something about the tone made her pause. Without looking up, she replied, her voice steady but firm. "I do. It's how I keep moving forward." There was no bitterness in her words, just a clear statement of fact. She wasn't interested in explaining herself. Her work spoke for itself. The businessman seemed taken aback, as though he hadn't expected her to answer at all. The other man fell silent, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the plane's engines and the soft clicking of passengers securing their bags. Briel stood up and adjusted her suit jacket, preparing to leave the plane. She had done all she could for today. The flight had been long, and the journey was not yet over. There was still work to do, but there was also a sense of satisfaction in her heart. She knew where she was headed, and nothing could take that away. As she made her way down the aisle, the two businessmen looked up from their seats. Their expressions had shifted from amusement to something else, perhaps surprise, perhaps respect. Briel didn't wait for their reaction. She simply walked forward, confident in her stride, ready to face whatever came next. The plane touched down smoothly, its wheels humming against the runway as the lights of the airport greeted them. Briel gathered her things, slipping her tablet into her bag and adjusting the sleeve of her suit jacket. The flight had been long, but she had already begun to shift her focus to the next phase of the day. This wasn't the end. It was simply a transition. As she made her way down the aisle, the usual rush of passengers trying to be the first off the plane filled the air. Briel moved at her own pace, stepping carefully over the feet of those who were already standing and reaching for their bags. She could feel the eyes on her again, the same looks that had followed her throughout the flight. But this time, she wasn't bothered. The moment had passed, and there was more important work ahead. Once she reached the jet bridge, Brielle was met by a representative from the airline. A man in a dark suit stepped forward with a polite smile. "Good evening, Miss Thomas. We're ready to escort you to the car," he said, his voice soft and respectful. Brielle nodded and followed him without a word. The representative led her through the airport, where the hustle of travelers continued around them, unaware of the quiet, powerful presence walking just a few steps ahead. Outside, the cold night air hit her as she stepped into the backseat of a sleek black car. The driver greeted her politely and quickly pulled away from the airport, heading toward the city. Brielle settled into the soft leather seat, closing her eyes for a moment. The silence of the car was a welcome change from the noise of the flight. She needed time to gather her thoughts before the big meeting the next day. The city lights flickered outside the window, casting shadows and reflections on the glass. Brielle thought back to the flight, to the strange feeling she had gotten from the flight crew and the two businessmen. It wasn't the first time she had been treated like she didn't belong, and it wouldn't be the last. But what mattered now was the meeting. Her company was on the brink of a major partnership, and that was where her focus needed to be. As the car sped through the city streets, Brielle felt a sense of calm settle over her. The world might not always understand her, but she didn't need their understanding. She had worked for every inch of success she had achieved, and she had earned her place at the table. It didn't matter how many people doubted her or tried to make her feel small. Her work, her drive, and her determination were all that mattered. The car finally pulled up to a tall building with glowing lights in the windows. Brielle took a deep breath and stepped out, ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. The evening was just beginning, but she had already decided that nothing would stand in her way. She had come too far to let anything hold her back. The evening air was crisp as Brielle stepped into the lobby of the building, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor. The towering glass windows let in a soft glow from the city lights outside, reflecting off the sleek, modern furniture inside. She had arrived at her destination, the headquarters of the airline she had been scheduled to meet with. Her mind was sharp, focused on the business ahead, but she couldn't completely shake the discomfort of earlier in the day. Still, she knew she couldn't let it distract her now. As she approached the reception desk, a young woman in a smart uniform stood up, greeting her with a polite smile. "Miss Thomas, welcome," she said, her voice soft but confident. "We've been expecting you. Please, follow me to the boardroom." Brielle nodded and followed the woman through the sleek hallways. The building was full of glass walls and modern art pieces, each corner carefully designed to give an air of sophistication. But Brielle didn't notice the artwork or the impressive interior. Her thoughts were already with the business at hand. The meeting tomorrow would be crucial. It wasn't just another contract. It was an opportunity for her company to take a huge step forward. And she wasn't about to let anything, or anyone, get in her way. The door to the boardroom opened with a soft swish, revealing a large table surrounded by chairs. On one side of the room, a group of men and women sat, some flipping through papers, others on laptops, all waiting for her arrival. Brielle took a moment to assess the room. She was no stranger to high-stakes meetings, but this one felt different. The eyes of the group turned to her as she entered, their gazes lingering for just a moment longer than usual. It was as if they were sizing her up, trying to figure out what she had to offer. She didn't mind. She had been through this before. Brielle had learned that people often judged based on appearances before they ever took the time to understand who someone truly was. But she knew her worth. Her experience, her knowledge, and her leadership had earned her a seat at the table. And tonight, she was going to make sure they knew that. She walked confidently to the head of the table and took her seat. The room fell into a brief silence, and then the conversation began. She listened closely, responding when necessary, her answers sharp and to the point. Her tone was calm, But there was a quiet strength in her words that made it clear she wasn't there to waste time. She had worked too hard to get to this point, and she wasn't about to let anyone doubt her. As the discussion continued, Brielle felt herself becoming more and more at ease. The tension from earlier in the day seemed to fade as the meeting progressed. She was in control here, and nothing, not the looks, not the judgments, could change that. She was exactly where she needed to be. The meeting stretched on for hours, but Brielle remained focused, navigating through the negotiations with skill and determination. By the time the room began to clear, there was a sense of accomplishment in the air. She had done what she came to do. She stood up from the table, giving a final nod to the group. "Thank you for your time," she said, her voice steady and strong. "I look forward to our future together." And with that, she walked out of the room, knowing that this was only the beginning. As Brielle left the boardroom, she couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The meeting had gone well. The discussions had been tough at times, but she had held her ground and made it clear that her company was a force to be reckoned with. Now, all she had to do was wait for the final decision. But deep down, she already knew the outcome. She had worked too hard, and her vision was too strong for them to ignore. The hallway outside the boardroom was quiet, the only sound being the soft tapping of her heels on the marble floor. She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath as she looked out through the tall windows of the building. The city was alive with lights and movement, but for a brief moment, it felt like the world had slowed down around her. The challenges of the day, the flight, the stairs, the silent judgments, seemed distant now. What mattered was the future, and it was looking brighter than ever. As she walked down the hallway, a few employees passed by, nodding politely as they recognized her. Brielle didn't stop to chat. She had learned over the years that her time was precious, and there was always more work to be done. The flight incident earlier in the day had been a small blip in the grand scheme of things. It was a reminder, though, that she was often judged by how others saw her, not by her abilities or achievements. But that was fine. She didn't need anyone's approval. Her work spoke for itself. The elevator doors opened, and Brielle stepped inside. She pressed the button for the ground floor, feeling the smooth rise of the elevator as it descended. Her mind raced through the next steps. She would have to prepare the final proposal for the new partnership. There were details to finalize, contracts to review, and strategies to put into place. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace, closing her eyes for a second as the elevator moved downward. The car was waiting for her outside, just as promised. The driver opened the door, and she slid into the back seat, settling into the soft leather. The city lights blurred past as the car made its way through the streets. Brielle had always loved the quiet of the night, the way the world seemed to pause when the sun went down. There was something comforting in the stillness, something that made her feel like anything was possible. As the car drove on, she thought back to the flight earlier that day. She wondered how the flight crew and the businessmen were feeling now. The video of the incident had gone viral, spreading across social media in the hours after the flight landed. Brielle hadn't said anything about it. She hadn't needed to. The video spoke for itself. And now, people were starting to take notice. They were starting to see her for who she truly was, not just the image others had painted for her. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Her work, her accomplishments, and her future were all that mattered. As the car turned onto a quiet street, Brielle felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had come a long way, and she wasn't done yet. There was still more to achieve, more to build, and nothing would stand in her way. The next morning, Brielle woke up early, as she always did. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden glow over the city outside her window. She stretched and glanced at the clock, already thinking about the day ahead. Today was the day that would determine whether the hard work of the past few months would pay off. The partnership she had been negotiating for so long was finally coming to a head. She could feel the weight of the moment, but there was no room for doubt. She had prepared for this, and she was ready. She stood up, went through her morning routine, and dressed in a sharp suit. The kind of outfit that made her feel like she could take on the world. The black blazer, the perfectly pressed trousers, and the simple yet elegant blouse underneath. It wasn't just about looking good. It was about feeling confident. She needed to be at her best today. And she knew that every detail mattered. As she sat down for a quick breakfast, her phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from her assistant, reminding her of the meeting time and confirming the final details of the presentation. Braille smiled to herself. She appreciated the support, but she didn't need reminders. She was already ahead of the game. She took a deep breath, ready to face whatever was coming her way. By the time she arrived at the meeting location, the building was buzzing with activity. Employees were rushing in and out, making last-minute preparations. Brielle took it all in stride, walking confidently through the front doors and up to the meeting room. She could feel the eyes of the employees and executives in the hallway, but this time it didn't bother her. She was used to being in the spotlight now. This was where she belonged. The meeting room was large and filled with glass walls, offering a view of the city below. A long table stretched across the middle of the room, with several seats already filled by the executives from the airline. Brielle took her place at the head of the table, setting her papers and tablet down in front of her. The room was quiet for a moment as everyone settled in, the tension thick in the air. But Brielle didn't feel nervous. This was what she had been working for. The presentation began, and Brielle took charge, guiding the room through the details of the partnership. Her voice was steady, her words clear and confident. She explained how the partnership would benefit both sides, laying out the numbers and the strategy behind it. She knew her material inside and out, and it showed. The executives listened intently, occasionally exchanging glances, but Brielle didn't waver. She had already proven herself, and today was no different. As the meeting progressed, she could see the shift in the room. The executives were starting to take her seriously. The doubts they might have had were slowly melting away, replaced by respect and admiration. By the end of the presentation, it was clear. They were on board. Brielle had done it. She had secured the partnership. As the meeting concluded, she shook hands with the executives, her smile calm but triumphant. The room was filled with congratulations, but Brielle's mind was already moving forward. This was just the beginning. The deal was done. As Brielle walked out of the meeting room, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. The hard work, the late nights, the countless hours spent preparing, it had all paid off. The partnership was secured. She had done what she came to do, and she had done it with strength and grace. The hallway was quieter now. The energy that had filled the building earlier in the day had shifted to a calm satisfaction. Brielle could hear the soft hum of conversations as employees discussed the outcome of the meeting. She had made her mark, and now the buzz of the company was centered around her success. But she didn't linger on the recognition. She had learned long ago that success wasn't about the applause. It was about the work. As she made her way back to her office, Brielle couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her here. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, times when it felt like everything was against her. She had been judged, underestimated, and overlooked. But none of that had stopped her. In fact, it had only made her more determined. Every setback had fueled her drive, pushing her to work harder, to prove that she belonged in every room she walked into. She entered her office, the familiar sight of her desk and the organized chaos of papers and files greeting her. She sat down and took a deep breath, allowing herself a brief moment to appreciate how far she had come. The view from her window looked out over the city, a city full of opportunities, and now her company was on the verge of even more. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her back to reality. It was a message from her assistant, updating her on the next steps. There were still contracts to finalize, more meetings to attend, and decisions to make. But for the first time in a while, Brielle felt a sense of peace. She had earned this moment, and nothing could take it away from her. The door to her office opened, and her assistant stepped in, offering a smile. "Congratulations, Miss Thomas. They're all excited about the partnership." Braille returned the smile, nodding. "Thank you," she said. "But this is just the beginning. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." Her assistant nodded, knowing that Braille was always thinking ahead. She had never been one to sit back and rest on her laurels. There was always something more to achieve, always a new goal to reach for. As the day wore on, Braille continued to move through her tasks with focus and determination. The partnership was a huge step forward, but she knew it was just one chapter in a much larger story. There would be challenges ahead, but she was ready for them. After all, she had already proven that nothing could stand in her way. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the office, Braille leaned back in her chair for just a moment, allowing herself a brief pause. The road to success had not been easy, but it had been worth every step. And as she looked out over the city, she knew this was only the beginning. The future was waiting, and she was ready to take it on.